Welcome from Tallinn, Estonia, in these pre-opening days of the Venice Architecture Biennale. Over the last year, our old capital city, Tallinn, here in Estonia, that always welcomed many visitors from around the world, has become a different kind of meeting place, a place that hosts the world virtually. Our country, Estonia, presently, by the way, a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, has hosted from this very stage in Tallinn many global meetings. And today we will continue in this stream to mark the opening of the first post-COVID truly global cultural event, the Architecture Biennale in Venice. We can just hope at this point that the term post-COVID is correct. The world is starting opening up again. Hopefully it will stay that way. How we will live together now is the central question asked in Venice this year. There is no right answer for that, but architects from over 60 countries are offering their visions, and we will do a short international preview of these visions here today. I'm joined here in Tallinn virtually by the curators from 6 countries, from the UK, Switzerland, our northern neighbor Finland, our Baltic neighbors Latvia and Lithuania, and of course Estonian curator in Venice. First, I will invite to our virtual stage the curator of the Lithuanian Pavilion in Venice. Please. What is the central theme, the headline of your pavilion?
The headline of the pavilion is paraphrasing the National Pavilion, and we call it the Lithuanian Space Agency. It is founded by an architect, designer, artist from Lithuania, Julijonas Urbanos, and we are thinking about outer space. How can we, as people of the world, make a planet of people in outer space?
Let's just see a short preview of Lithuanian Pavilion, and then I have a question for you in Lithuanian.
Du 2019 metais įsteigiau Lietuvos erdvės agentūrą, kosminę organizaciją, kurios tikslas tyrinėti kosminę vaizduotę ir gravitacinę estetiką. Šios organizacijos atsiradimas buvo paskatintas tam tikrų reiškinių, kurie apibrėžia naują kosmoso amžių. Vienas iš jų kosminės kultūros išsiplėtojimas, kitas tai kosminė ekonomika, dar kitas kosmoso privatizavimas ir trečiasis, kuris labai aktualus projektui, tai yra susivokimas, kad mes esame pernelyg žemiški. Ir būtent šią įžvalgą išryškina astro disciplinos atsiradimas. Tiesiog senos žemiškos disciplinos prisideda prie didelį astro ir žvelgia į save iš ateivio perspektyvos. Mums ypatingai aktualu architektūra ir kaip architektūra, kaip astroarchitektūra persvarsto save žiūrėdama iš nežemiškojo perspektyvos. Ir tai pakankama yra kebli situacija, nes architektūros istorija yra grįsta dviejom problemom, kurios yra labai žemiškos. Viena iš jų yra gravitacija, antra yra žmogus. Tai su Lietuvos erdvės agentūra mes svarstome, kaip būtų galima radikaliai persvarstyti architektūrą iš būtent šios perspektyvos, kai dingsta žemiškosios problemos - gravitacija ir žmogus. Lietuvos erdvės agentūros pirmoji kosminė programa yra būtent ta, kuri apsvarstytų minėtas problemas ir įžvalgas ir inscenizuotų į taip vadinamą architektūrinę fikciją - planetą iš žmonių. Programa siūlo siųsti žmones į kosmosą, į specifinę kosmose vietą ir iš jų formuoti naują kosminį kūną, planetą. Viena vertus tai yra fiktyvi idėja, kita vertus yra realistiška, nes įtraukiama didžiulė komanda įvairiausių disciplinų ekspertų, kurie apsvarsto, kaip iš tiesų būtų galima suformuoti šitą naują planetą iš žmonių ir kokie būtų padariniai estetiniai, etiniai, politiniai ir ypatingai architektūriniai. Agentūros projektas Planeta iš žmonių bus pristatyta su didelė komanda, kurią subūriau nuo 2019 metų kartu su Lietuvos erdvės agentūros įkūrimu. Pirmiausia, pakviečiau Juliją Reklaitę, po to Jana Boelen, tada ir atsirado Milda Batakytė ir taip toliau. Komanda 3 metus kartu dirbo taip glaudžiai, kad turbūt būtų galima sakyti, kad Lietuvos erdvės agentūra yra ne fiktyvi institucija, o tikra institucija, turinčia 42 komandos narius.
Šių metų Lietuvos paviljono Venecijos architektūros bienalė organizuoja rezidencijų šiuolaikinio meno ir edukacijos centras Rupert. Ir paviljonas įsikurs bažnyčioje, šiuo metu nepašventintoje, neveikiančioje bažnyčioje, Santa Marija di Dereliti.
Tik fokusas buvo į tai, kad tai yra keliaujantis objektas, keliaujanti konsteliacija architektūrinė ir kad jisai gali adaptuoti skirtingose aplinkose. Ir tai buvo motyvas, kodėl galiausiai tas architektūrinis sprendimas yra toks išrenkamas, dalinai išlankstomas ir galima pavadinti pritempiamas prie žemės. Labai tiesiogiai architektūriškai su trosais, laikančiam konstrukcijom.
Mūsų pasiūlyta ta keliaujanti laboratorija susideda iš erdvinio protagonisto, tai skenerio, kuris skaitmenizuoja ir meta žmonių kūnus į tą eksperimentinę žmonių planetą, prototipą jos. Lygiai taip pačiai dar vienas toks irgi epicentriškas objektas, agentūros kabutėse galbūt recepcija, stalas, o ją suskliaudžia dvi šviesos būrės, kaip būdu šiek tiek nusigręžiant nuo aplinkoje dominuojančią tokią barokinę, taipogi kitokią, galbūt kito atskaitos taško kosminio naratyvo.
Lietuvos erdvės agentūra, svarbu paminėti, kad veikia ir kaip savotiška biurokratinė scenografija. Ji viena vertus yra tikra, bet kita vertus ne visai tikra, nes mes neturime raketnešių. Todėl galima svarstyti apie ją kaip savotišką priemonę sustiprinti tikėjimą tą idėją, kurią mes pristatysime. Tikėti tuo architektūriniu pasakojimu.
So this is Lithuanian Pavilion dealing with life in the outer space. Are you planning to send people to Mars? That is the question that is debated very hotly in the world. Or where is this new planet that you're proposing?
No, we are not planning to live on space. We think, in fact, our project is a comment, a critique that we formulate to these kind of explorations. We really believe that we have to live on Earth, and but thinking about space and thinking in space is certainly something which help us in these kind of crisis we are in at this moment. Architecture can be used also for thinking critically and imaginative about futures. And that's what we want to do. We believe that the Lithuanian Space Agency can function as a kind of awareness machine about a possible future, a potential future.
Thank you very much. We will come back to the Lithuanian Space Agency in our discussion after the presentations, but let's move on. And next up is Latvia. Hello there. Latvian Pavilion and Latvian theme is technology. So few words to introduce the video about your pavilion.
Good to be with all of you together. So the topic of how we live together usually deals with the relationship between people and the various spaces that they inhabit. But the Latvian Pavilion introduces a third player, technology, which nowadays is ever present both in architecture and in our everyday lives. And with our exhibition, we hope to comment on the quite complicated relationship that people have with technology within architecture.
Okay, let's just preview the Latvian pavilion here.
The main question of this year's Biennale is how to live together. We decided to narrow it down to how will we live together with the machine, meaning our oftentimes ambiguous and difficult relationship with technologies.
Our journey began with quite a dystopian feeling that technology takes up too much space. Watching how our honest architecture overgrows with layers upon layers of pipes, ducts, wires and boxes of different shapes and sizes.
Pilnīgi noteikti tehnoloģisks pārsātinājums ēkās, arhitektūrā var būt apgrūtinājums. Sistēmas savā starpā bieži vien nesaprotās tik labi, lai viņas varētu radīt to kvalitatīvāko pienesumu.
I like this analogy that when technology is sufficiently advanced, you cannot tell it apart from magic. And when you don't understand what the technologies are doing, naturally you resist it.
So we expressed this initial feeling in our model. We wanted to build a bunch of useless and overcomplicated machines. We wanted to ridicule our enemy.
Spending some time thinking about, we slowly realized that technologies are just instruments for our own benefit. And we went for abstraction or symbolism, and we substituted it for this black pipe that symbolizes a wider range of technologies.
Sakarā ar to, ka pandēmijas dēļ Venecijas arhitektūras bienāle tika pārcelta par 1 gadu, mums radās iespēja Venecijas ekspozīciju realizēt mūsu dzimtajā pilsētā Rīgā apvērstā veidā. Tāpēc, ka tajā brīdī ir iestājusies pandēmija, cilvēks ir atstāts viens pats savā mājoklī, un saikne ar apkārtējo pasauli ir iespējama tikai ar tehnoloģiju palīdzību.
The exposition consists of 2 parts. One is the installation itself, and we have also made a book. There are short stories that show the techno-nonsense that people often find in their spaces. And then the other part of the text is an expert's commentary. Thus, we managed to show both opposing views on people's relationship with technology. And the installation also tries to mimic this ambiguous relationship people have with technology.
Melno cauruļu muģeklis simbolizē to tehnoloģiju arvien lielāko lomu mūsu mājokļos, kas aizņem arvien vairāk vietas. Tā nosacītā dzīves telpa, kas ir palikusi starp šīm caurulēm, tā ir tā dzīvojamā telpa, kas paliek cilvēkam, pārējo visu aizņem tehnoloģijas.
But when you enter this empty space, you realize that the technology is actually responding to you and it's interacting with you. It's being friendly and useful.
The sensor captures your movement and the lights slowly light up, and the sound of your footsteps are amplified, given an effect of echo.
Un tajā brīdī mēs parādām arī to, ka viss šis draudīgais muģeklis, kas no ārpuses izskatās draudīgs, viņš īstenībā ir domāts cilvēkam.
Through this transformation, we hope to transform the way the visitors look at technology and the way the visitors think about technology.
Tehnoloģijas tieši tāpat savā būtībā ir domātas cilvēkiem. Cilvēki rada tehnoloģijas priekš cilvēkiem.
It is a tool made by us for us. And as any tool, it must be used responsibly and wisely.
Mums vajag visiem kopīgi iemācīties sadzīvot ar tehnoloģiju, ar to mašīnu, kas pamazām jau pārtop arī mūsos.
The title of our installation, It's Not For You, It's For The Building, is of course a provocation. Many of us experience a lot of resistance when it comes to new technologies and change in general. It's a natural process. The only way through is forward, and when you understand that technology is only a tool that we use, you realize that what seemed for the building is for you after all.
This is the Latvian Pavilion in Venice, and in this video I already got answer to my question that I wanted to ask you. Is this new age of technology and technology in this age our friend or foe?
Yeah, basically the question that we are asking, and we hope to talk with the techno-pessimists to make them feel more understood and hopefully turn them more into a techno-optimist. But we'll see how that goes in the installation.
Thank you very much. This is Latvian Pavilion, and we will come back to you in our discussion part. Thank you. And next up in our program is Finland, our northern neighbor. And you are asking the question how to find new ways to build. So that seems to be the headline of the Finnish pavilion, the new standards. Or what?
Yes, thank you very much for being here. Actually, this year at Venice, the Finnish representation, New Standards, takes a historical look, in fact, at the question, how will we live together, by going back to a moment in the early 1940s when Finland had to answer this question very urgently and put up what was one of the most successful manufacturers of prefabricated wooden housing in the world. So we look at the evolution, the sort of birth and evolution of a company called Puutalo Timber Houses Ltd, which was founded in the wake of the housing crisis of the 1940s, and over the 15-year period produced hundreds of thousands of houses that in fact were then shipped around the world, very kind of urgently answering the question at that moment, and laying the foundations of many modern systems of industrial construction that still guide architecture today.
Very interesting. You are probing the old concept of architecture, the wooden architecture in a new way. So let's see what Finland has to offer this year in Venice.
Welcome to the Pavilion of Finland and the New Standards exhibition. Standardization in building is frequently deplored as monotonous and boring even, but it persists as a recurring dream for architects who seek to harness the power of industrial production to address challenges of urbanization. The exhibition examines the conditions affecting standardized, industrialized and manufactured building by revisiting a forgotten chapter of wood construction in post-war Finland. The story centers on the industrial enterprise Puutalo Oy Timber Houses Ltd, which was established in 1940 as part of the national response to a refugee crisis brought about by war. In less than a decade, the company became one of the largest manufacturers of prefabricated wooden buildings in the world.
From 1940 to 1955, Finland exported hundreds of thousands of buildings to sites on every inhabited continent, constructing a legacy of housing and urbanization that has been largely overlooked. These houses, schools, barracks and dormitories were designed by some of the most prominent figures of the period, but they have rarely been included in the historical surveys of Finnish architecture. Nevertheless, the company and the buildings that it produced contributed significantly to the post-war rise in living standards. Today, Puutalo houses may be the nation's most widespread architectural export.
Lattian lämpöeristyksen muodostavat alimmaisena tervapahvi. Hyvin kelpaa valmista yhden perheen tikkanimistä taloa katsellakin aurinkoisella männikkörinteellä.
The New Standards project is working to locate and document Puuttalo sites around the world in an online map, which may be explored on the website newstandards.info.
Situated at the intersection of architecture and industrial design, these structures use a limited range of standard components to achieve thousands of variations suited to different functional, climatic, and cultural conditions. These simple but effective solutions have allowed successive generations to remodel and reconfigure the buildings to suit their changing needs. After almost 80 years, these modest houses have shaped the experiences of thousands of inhabitants and reconfigured urban landscapes around the world. Over the course of a year, the research team has traveled to sites from Europe to Latin America in order to see how these buildings have changed and to meet the residents that live in them today. 3 of these sites are the focus of a photographic series showing neighborhoods in Helsinki, Finland, Aarhus, Denmark, and Barranquilla, Colombia.
Instead of composing with form or space, I try to focus on people and show the settings in which they live. Everyday moments like working in the yard or playing in the trampoline aren't glamorous, but they can be beautiful, funny, and sometimes a bit strange. Occasionally, there's melancholy as well, but all of these are different kinds of beauty that you can find in a daily life. The photos are still about the houses too. In Colombia, this grandmother moved into her little house in 1957, and she raised 9 children there with her husband. The man sitting next to her is one of them. He was born in that room, and he has spent his whole life in that house. Today, his own wife and son live there as well. Of course, shooting in different places at different times of year, the climate becomes part of the story as well. In Finland, the winters can get dark, but the low angle of the winter light and the snow have a way of giving a bit of drama, even to simple things.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Finland really brings us back to the essentials of building, back to the wooden house. So we're talking about concrete, glass, steel today in architecture, but you are bringing us back to wood.
We do. I think one of the things that we kind of bring forward with the exhibition is a reconsideration of the way that materials work in building, not just as something that we experience, but also as something that are part of global exchange. One of the interesting things about this period and this company is the way that the export of timber from Finland became integral to the sort of rebuilding of the Finnish economy in the post-war period. Finland started to trade wooden houses for things like coffee and coal and oil and tractors. And this became, I think, connects us back to the realization that our considerations of material in architecture are not simply kind of aesthetic, but also deeply connected to cultural and economic conditions as well.
Thank you very much for this comment on the Finnish pavilion in Venice, and we will see you again shortly during our discussion. And up next is Switzerland in our discussion. And Switzerland is bringing to Venice the very pressing issue in today's international politics, the borders, the border areas. The COVID crisis brought us back the notion of borders in Europe. The borders almost disappeared in Europe before, and suddenly they were back again. So your issue is the border. How will you explore that?
Thank you. The project started with the main idea or the main hypothesis that saying that the border is probably the laboratory of this beginning of this century. As we can say that in the 20th century, we can say that the cities was the laboratory of the architecture and urbanism. We think that for this century, for these two, for these years, it could be the border. And the title of the project is Orae, Experiences on the Border. And we choose this word. Orae is a Latin old word synonym of borders, and it signifies the end of the territory, the edges of the territory, but in figuratively way it signifies to the beginning of something. And basically this is what we learned from our project during these 2 years working on the border, on Switzerland, with inhabitants of the border.
So let's see what Switzerland has to offer in Venice.
Maybe the main idea of the project is on the title of the project. Orae, it's a Latin word, and it was a synonym of a border and an edge, also a beginning of something.
Orea, Experiences on the Border, talks about national borders, about what they mean. They're so important for our lives, but we don't know much about them. We don't know how they look like. We don't know much about the lives of the people living along the border. With this project, the team investigates what opportunities, what problems the border offers.
We think that architect has to take care of this territory because it's a collective space. It's where architecture can reach politic engagement.
We are absolutely convinced that the border is the laboratory of the 21st century, and it's an amazing place to see, to observe, to understand, and probably to work on the contemporary space.
The project team traveled to the Swiss border and they made a stop at several locations. There they engaged with the local population. They wanted to meet the people, find out about their lives.
So we went to the territory. We traveled all around Switzerland and its neighbor countries with our mobile studio and the pluridisciplinary team, asking and collecting the experience of the inhabitants and their perception and what is the reality of the border for them.
It's a long time working with people. We learned from them. It takes a lot of time, and it was amazing and beautiful.
In the exhibition here at the Swiss Pavilion, the centerpiece is the large gallery. You're surrounded by visual and acoustic impressions. You have videos, you have models. They portray the people that the team met on site. And the models, they tell us about how these people imagine their surrounding, their living space. It's not about reading long texts, it's about an immersive experience with all of your senses.
The main goal of the exhibition is to show the diversity of the border and the complexity of the border as an inhabited territory. About the models, what is really important is they are mental models. Each one is like a diagram that represents the perception of each person of his territory.
It didn't start with the question of scale, of what they are going to represent. We just asked them what represents the border in your everyday life. So they start without nothing. And Pierre was helping also to develop a kind of language, a kind of way to represent, to modelize in 3 dimensions the perception, also the thought, and also the hope for these territories. And it's really interesting. All this process was captured by the video.
It has the capacity to catch the emotion and the portraits of each one of these people who did the models.
We are two architects, landscape architect, journalist, one filmmaker, and one artist sculptor. So it was really a chance to share our knowledge and also to share it with the inhabitants that teach us lots of things.
I had the chance to join the team when they worked at the triple frontier between Germany, France and Switzerland near the city of Basel. And it was fascinating to see how they work together with a Swiss person that crosses the border every day with his bike to get to work in Weil am Rhein. It was clear that the border could be something very transparent, very soft. But the team, on the other hand, also worked with refugees, for instance, at the Swiss border in the south, border to Italy, and there, obviously, they were confronted with completely different notion and perception of what a border can be.
We had an extraordinary experience of the reality of the border, the diversity of the situation and the people we met.
Maybe what we learned from the people who are living on the border and who we met during these 2 years, that the border could be something else, could be a beginning of a project, of a collective something, and it could be a places of passage, of alterity, of complexity too.
Thank you very much for this video, but let's explore this issue a bit more. I was reading that your pavilion reveals the political nature of borders, but also the poetic nature of borders. You already mentioned that border is the end and the new beginning. So could you elaborate a little further?
The idea of the project is to, how we say that we have this border that now with the pandemic, but for this 10 years before, it becomes a really problematic issue with the migration crisis, with all the crises we live in these 10 years. But when we met people, the main idea of the project is to go to the territory, to meet people, inhabitants who are living on the border. And what we learned from them, that we can transform this point of view of the border and we can reconsider it like a territory, that it could be a place of relationship or of otherness and not of identity and of enclosure.
Very thought-provoking, the Swiss Pavilion. Thank you very much for this short introduction. And up next is the UK, and we have two curators who are bringing us to the city square. We've been talking about borders, their architecture itself, the materials, the wood, but the center of the city and the center of community is always the square, and you are bringing us to the square.
Yes, hello, thank you for having us here today. I'm Madeleine Kessler and I'm here today with my co-creator Manijeh Verghese. And our pavilion is called the Garden of Privatised Delights, and it's all about privatised public space in the UK and how architects can really work with local communities and stakeholders to rethink public space, make it more inclusive and accessible for people to use. So we're looking at spaces like the high street, the pub, the garden square and green spaces in the city, and also how there's nowhere in the cities for young people anymore. And therefore, how can we open up these spaces and rethink them for the 21st century? Two of the rooms are also looking at kind of policy making and legacy and legislation, and how architects can sort of engage themselves at a more strategic level, as well as in design to open up our public spaces.
And I have a question also for your co-creator. You are talking about the privatization of public spaces, but privatization kind of means closing up spaces. You are trying to say that those spaces should be open for us.
Yes, I mean, in general, we think that privatized public space is a really rich area to explore. And the title, The Garden of Privatized Delights, actually comes from a painting that inspired us by the Dutch painter Hieronymus Bosch. And his painting is called The Garden of Earthly Delights. And it's framed as a triptych. So there's the positive space of heaven on the left, the negative space of hell on the right, and then there's the middle ground of earth in the center. And so we saw privatized public space as another version of this middle ground, a rich opportunity for architects to intervene within that sits between the extremes of utopia of common land before the Enclosures Act of the 18th century, the dystopia of total privatization. And then this middle ground is really important because it's too easy to say that private is bad and public is good. And actually, there's lots of amazing spaces that would never have been opened up to the public were it not for the private sector actually opening them up. And but what we need to see more of is kind of more transparency in terms of how that land is managed and accessed. And what we'd like to see more of as well is that the public is more aware, I guess, of what their rights are in that space and how they can use those spaces in a greater capacity going forward.
Thank you very much for this short introduction. And now, via video, let's see what the UK has to offer us in Venice.
Do you consent to participate? Find out more and take control of your data at Metoden.
So you're still in the room, but like you're somewhere else. I think that would be cool.
So many interesting questions you are raising. How the private can become public is the central question. Just a short answer, how you see that?
We think that too often everyone's been sort of working in silos, and it's been very sort of set up of private's bad, public's good. And what we're saying is it sort of goes back generations within the British psyche to have these privatised public spaces. So, for example, the pub, the original public house, the opening up of someone's living room to let the public in. What we want to do is bring different stakeholders around the table. So community groups, landowners, policymakers, architects, bring everyone around the table to then open up these privatised public spaces so that people can access them. One of our rooms, the Garden Square, looks at sort of this typology within central London and other Georgian cities in the UK, where you have these garden squares with railings surrounding them. And it's such a simple act to remove the railings so anyone can access these squares. And in fact, that did happen in World War II. And then the railings were reinstated. But we're looking at how you can sort of do design moves like that alongside sort of policy and legislation to make these spaces more inclusive.
So access is the key word in your pavilion.
Absolutely. Access and giving people a sense of ownership and allowing everyone to be involved in this conversation in order to allow everyone to be able to access our public spaces.
Is your co-curator wanting to say something, to add something?
Sure. So to add to that, I think what's really important to us is that the public becomes more aware of what they can do in privatized public space. So too often there's a lot of signage in these spaces that prevents you from doing things, that tells you what you can't do. And something that we think is really important is that the public knows their rights and that they have greater agency to occupy these spaces, to come together and to actually take more ownership over those spaces. So it is about access, but it's also about a sense of ownership and how that can be created in order for us all to collectively care better for our privatized public spaces.
Thank you very much. Very interesting pavilion, and we will shortly come back to you in our discussion. And finally, Estonia. The curator of Estonian Pavilion has a very Czech name, Jiri, and he is from there, but he fluently speaks Estonian, and he talks in Venice about small towns in Estonia. So that shows how small and global the world is. The Czech can be Estonian as well. So welcome to our discussion. What will you present in the name of Estonia in Venice?
We are presenting Estonia in Venice through public space in depopulating small towns, in shrinking towns, because population shrinkage leads to underinvested public space in empty houses. And all those effects of depopulation is influencing the way how local people feel themselves living in their hometown. If your public space is not attractive, then you start to doubt if you are living in good place, and if you are doubting about the quality of the place, about the quality of your hometown, about its future, then you are much less prepared to be active, to improve your environment. You are much. It's much easier for you to leave the town, and that's why we see public space and quality of the public space as a good tool what local governments can use to hold their population in the town. And the role of architecture and architects is huge here. And because architects are normally prepared to design something new, then we feel that this role is also something unexpected for architects. We don't need to deal only with new areas and new houses, but we need to deal also with area which is losing people, and where we don't need to build something new, but we need to focus on the emotions of the people living still there.
Okay, and let's illustrate your words now with a short video. Estonian Pavilion in Venice.
If we want to live together, then we need to address both needs of people in growing and shrinking regions. Those regional differences, what we have just now in Europe or in Estonia, are too big for be sustainable. Because if you have a huge part of population which doesn't feel well, then once it starts to influence to the development of the whole society. So we as architects, we need to address similar needs of those people living in growing and shrinking cities. In our case, we figure out that we need to deal with 4 different aspects of urban space. First is obvious. If you have less people and too many buildings, then you need to demolish them. In every town there are some really symbolic buildings which has really huge historical value. They are like a sign of this town, and without those buildings the town will not be the same town. And in the case of population shrinkage, private sector is not motivated to invest in them because there is no profit. So local government need to take this role itself to try to buy those buildings, to find them a new function and investment to improve them. Third tool is that for any town, it's really important that locals would have quality living spaces. And in the case of shrinkage, when private sector is not prepared to deliver them these quality apartments on normal market, then once more, at least for some time, it needs to be a local government who intervene in this market with apartments and propose with subsidies of public sector quality apartments to locals. Architects are able to make the connection between locals and their hometown more stronger. And this is the base factor which can deliver the future for shrinking towns. Fourth and most expensive tool what you can use is this investment in urban space. It's maybe among all those tools the easiest one because streets and parks, they are public, so you don't need to buy them. It's also really positive thing what you are doing. Tools what we are presenting in our exposition in Venice, we are sure that they are applicable everywhere in similar towns all over the world. They are universal. You need to accept this shrinkage. You need to understand why population is shrinking. You need to understand what are the outcomes of shrinkage on urban space, and you need to change those things which locals don't like mostly in this shrinking environment. And this is really universal. To open coffees, flower shops, haircut salons, for example. This changement you will see even in urban space because you will no more have a city center which has a lot of empty houses, but you will have city center when you can sit in the coffee, when you can go to a restaurant, when you can buy flower. And on the end, it will change also the economy of this town. Now, New Square is functioning like a lightening of this situation. Square itself is nice, but people are really worried about the buildings around. They are ashamed that the center of the Valga is looking like it is looking, and I see this changement as really positive because it means that locals started to think about their town. They started to think about this, how the city center should look like and how it is looking. And this is the base point for some real change because people have once more accepted this area as a city center. New Square started to be a real natural center point of the town life. If we have some market or some festivities, it's naturally there on this New Square. In the Christmas time, we have a Christmas tree there, and in winter time, there is a skating possibility on the square. But square is functioning also in everyday life. We have children playground there. There are some sports elements also. You can play street basketball there, and it's also somehow really naturally place where young people from Valga is meeting together.
We now see that when people come here, it creates joy. I don't think necessarily that it's the pizza that makes people happy, but I think it's something to do with the place, with life, or with regeneration on the whole. I think that we also came here because the square itself created hope.
It was just a parking space where people came to park their cars. It's now a very, very beautiful place where people can hang, enjoy culture, do outdoor activities and just enjoy the free time here. And it has changed a lot our community.
Now we kind of have a place to meet other people, you know, you come together here, because otherwise we had like, well, you meet people on the main street, but it's not the same. You can come here and spend some nice time here. You can sit down and talk to people, and more people come to see the lake, to spend time here.
Very interesting. Jiri, you are the architect of a small town in Estonia, Valga. That town has a sister city or sister town, Valka. This is right at the border. Who carefully watched this video of Estonia and Latvia. And the small towns are still alive in the day and age when we are all talking about urbanization, about growth of mega cities. But there are still those small, homely towns.
Yes, they are, but let's say the context where people in those small towns are used to live is complicated for them, because, for example, in case of Valga, depopulation process is running already for 30 years, 3 decades of living through the situation where most of people are moving away, where you are losing services, where you feel that state is moving its agencies away. It's really complicated, and it's really influencing the way how locals are feeling themselves in the town. And we really see that through this investment in urban space, we can change this mood. We can give back hope to locals that they would once more be proud of their hometown.
Thank you very much. So these are 6 views of how we will live together in this day and age, in this new world post-COVID, and all those ideas are explored in the Architecture Biennale in Venice. And let's continue now here in our virtual public space, public square, a discussion about architecture today, and explore the question, how will we live together in this day and age? I will bring back all the participants who are in our discussions from Lithuania, from Latvia, from Finland, from Switzerland, from UK, and from Estonia. Most of the pavilions in Venice were planned and the concepts were kind of worked out before the COVID crisis within the last 2 years. But the last year has changed a lot in our world. How has this pause changed your views on your topics, and what are the lessons the architects have learned during this crisis? Let's start from Lithuania.
Lessons learned, or maybe better is to say insights that were developed over time. I think we are presenting a bit a different perspective, a speculative design project, a project where we start to imagine another world. Architecture as a tool to think how worlds can be formed differently, and prototyping, therefore, to the uttermost, almost absurd way of thinking, using technology and architecture and space and outer space as a way to think and create new narratives around architecture. That's what we present in the Lithuanian Space Agency.
So what are those new narratives?
These new narratives are, is what we see is, and there we are maybe also a bit critical towards what is going on in the world, is the digital space we are in now has, of course, the fact that we are together, but also alienate us. We also see that technocratic views are really and private companies are, for instance, taking over not only parts of and colonizing parts of the world, but are also taking over parts of space, outer space. And the Lithuanian architect designer Julijonas Urbanos came up with an idea to create a planet of people where that we scan people in our space agency and we shoot them to space in order to create there again through gravitational forces a new planet, a kind of way of rethinking Earth and rethinking space in itself. That's what we are doing.
You mentioned already technology. Latvia is dealing directly with technology, and in some ways technology is our savior during the last year, because we can meet today in this virtual space thanks to technology.
Yes, I couldn't agree more with you. And I think that we have actually benefited a lot from the pandemic in terms of deepening our understanding about the complicated relationship people have with technology. And as we have seen in the past year, technology can be such a powerful tool, especially when used with intent and mindfully. And it has also proven that people can adapt to rapid technological change, as we all did in this past year. And I think that also shows us that we can adapt to the coming technological solutions that will deal with the climate change. And that's sort of good news.
But where is the red line for you that we should not cross when we talk about the human interaction with technology? When the technology actually starts to take over our lives?
Yeah, I mean, in our work and preparing this exhibition and the book, speaking with many people, clients and architects, we sense that there is a strong opposition and resistance to technology taking over our spaces that we inhabit. And the aim of our whole narrative is to remind the technologists and architects and other professionals involved in solving all sorts of problems, to remind them that people are still at the center of architecture, even in the 21st century, and that we must take the human perspective and experience into account. On the other hand, we would also like to remind the users of architecture that technology is a means to an end. It is created for our own needs, and what might seem not for you at the beginning is for you at the end.
I've been talking to many scientists during the last year, and they are saying that the robots are developing fast, but the human mind is still stronger and more complicated and more powerful. So maybe in next decades, still humans will rule the world more. But talking about the human dimension, during this year, Finland was named for the 4th consecutive year the happiest country in the world. And you are talking about wooden architecture. You are talking about this human dimension in architecture, bringing back this small, lovable house. So for you, the human dimension has been important point for your work at the Pavilion, but also in Finland in general, it seems.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I'm sure whatever survey named Finland happiest place in the world wasn't interviewing me sometime in March, because our pavilion began with this brilliant idea that we would travel around and visit a number of countries in 2020 and document these houses as they had been built. That had to be changed rather radically somewhere in the early part of the year. But I think that one thing we kept from that was the idea that part of the question of how we sort of represent architecture relates also to the way that people inhabit it. The photographer who was mentioned in our video is a photographer who has never, as he told us when we commissioned him, never taken pictures of buildings as such. We commissioned him instead to take pictures of the people who inhabit buildings and sort of drive the focus. And I think that drives the focus of the whole exhibition. The other thing I might just say, you asked about in general about the way that our perspective changed because of the current crises. It caused us in many practical challenges, but it also caused us, I think, in a very positive way to reconsider what crises brings about for architecture. And looking back at a moment in 1940 when Finland faced tremendous crises, the onset of war, looking at architects like Toivo Jäntti, who had just completed the Olympic Stadium for the Olympics that Helsinki was to have hosted in 1940 and didn't host until 1952. Jäntti then went to work for this company designing thousands of quite modest wooden buildings that continue to exist. So reconsidering sort of how we represent architecture through photography, but also how we sort of think about architects and their contributions. Perhaps the legacy of Toivo Jäntti is not just or the legacy of any architect is not just a singular public building, but these thousands of houses that have proliferated across Finland and across the world. And I think that this is one of the kind of reframings that the pandemic has certainly brought for us.
Thank you. Switzerland is bringing to Venice, I think, very important term, border. And as I said before, and you mentioned before, suddenly we felt that, yes, there are borders, even in Europe, even in European Union, that tries to be a big bloc. Well, Switzerland was always separate. It's not a part of European Union, but it's part of the European map. So what's the lessons from Switzerland, standing alone there in the middle of European Union during the COVID crisis?
When we started this project 2 years ago, we met a lot of people in Switzerland, but also in Germany, in Italy, in France, in Austria, in Liechtenstein, and we met a lot of people coming from Eritrea, Afghanistan, etc. So what I would like to say by that people living in the border are coming from all parts of the world. So it's not only a question of Switzerland about this project, but you are right. Maybe if we usually say that Switzerland it's a country of neighborhood. So, and it's a quite country where there is not a lot of problems. But if something could happen, it could be happened in Switzerland, we usually say. So maybe it's this idea to work on borders, on Switzerland, in the heart of Europe.
Great. And the UK, I remember those images from a few weeks ago when the pubs in London opened up, the city squares opened up, people were just streaming out to the streets. Everybody was so happy. I think the lockdown was more extreme in UK than in most other places in our discussion. So that showed how people really need this common space to come together after this separation. So very, very topical issue that you're exploring this year in Venice.
Absolutely. The past year has really brought to the forefront of a conversation the importance of access to public space. For the first time in the UK's history, every single pub across the country closed. At the beginning of the first lockdown, this time last year, parks were closed. And there was suddenly a huge kind of public uproar that the importance of having outdoor space for both mental and physical health, especially when people are living in denser and denser sort of parts of the city and accommodation without any access to outdoor space. And interestingly, we saw, children take over streets as the playground once again. The street was the original children's playground, and then with the onset of the motor car, suddenly streets became very dangerous places to play. And as traffic reduced over the past year, once again, children could reclaim the streets. And there's now sort of quite a big kind of change in the UK of people starting to take over their streets as play streets and sort of starting to rethink what our public spaces should be. Something that's also been quite exciting sort of over the past sort of 10, 20 years, the public sector has increasingly become more and more risk averse. And suddenly they were there was kind of force to be able to rapidly change and roll out schemes such as cycle lanes and sort of testing new ideas and being less kind of scared of failure, as long as we're kind of learning lessons and testing ideas along the way. And so it does feel like there has been opportunities to really rethink our public spaces and how we use them, which have been really exciting for the kind of topics we've been exploring in the pavilion.
And your co-curator, your view of the past year, the lessons.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from the past year. And while a lot of these topics on privatized public space were urgent already before COVID, whether it's the closure of the pub or the disappearance of retail up and down the high street, I think the last year has made those kinds of spaces even more under threat than before. But we've also, as Maddie was saying, seen a lot of innovation in terms of like how these spaces can be used in more diverse ways by different groups of people. And so a lot of pubs became spaces of mutual aid. People have started to use vacant spaces on the high street for different forms of exchange that aren't just reliant on monetary transactions, but actually are thinking of kind of more inventive ways we can actually use these spaces and maybe new funding models that could allow them to exist in kind of more productive ways that actually benefit the wider community. And so it's a kind of, I guess, a time of optimism now as things start to open up about what could be done differently and how some of these spaces that were already under threat can actually be preserved through the community being more engaged and through kind of the public sector and the private sector working together more, as well as greater accountability of kind of who has rights to kind of maintain these spaces and manage them and how we can open them up further so more and more people can use them because of what Maddie said earlier about the need for privatized public space or the need for access to public space in general that was really kind of severely felt in the first lockdown and in subsequent lockdowns. And it's kind of shown us how important it is to kind of think about parks and green spaces across cities, whether we could change things like golf courses and school playgrounds so that they could be opened up at different times of the week or day to the surrounding community. So there's lots of really interesting strategies that people have tested out over the past year, and we feel hopeful that we can learn from them to kind of make long-term change happen.
Great, thank you very much. Jiri, we just heard from the UK that pub is the focal point in many communities there. What is the focal point in Estonian small towns? Not the pub, not the bar, still the public square, I guess.
Why not? I think that maybe not the Irish pub, but still, when you feel really proud about your hometown, normally this is in the moment when you have some visitors, they came for one day, and you go with them to city square, you sit in some coffee and show them how nice the area is. And this moment is not important for the visitor, because visitor may leave in several hours and maybe he or she will never remember what he or she saw. But it's really important for you, because in this moment you are really proud. And this proudness is this emotion which connects you with your hometown and which makes you act. So I feel samely as our Great Britain colleagues that pub or public coffee is the place which is really important for the local life. And second comment, you ask about this COVID changed perspective, and we really believe that this is some kind of chance for small depopulating towns, because if in Great Britain you are talking about privatization of public space, which is the result of the strong influence of private sector on public space, then in shrinking cities we do not have such pressure, because we do not have private sector to invest. We are much more free to deal with our public space, and we have much more opportunities to change it. And depopulation, of course, leads to less people. And if you have less people, then there is a lower chance to get virus from somewhere. So we really see it as an opportunity. And also this COVID pandemic situation get us to be more open towards distance working. And it means that you can live somewhere else when you are working. And as a result, we have already some data from Estonia which are showing that in March 2020 there was much more people outside the capital Tallinn than in February 2020. So there was really a big changement of placement of population, which shows that people, in fact, they want to live somewhere else, not in the capital, and the work forced them to live in capital of Tallinn. So we believe that if small towns are attractive and if they are, if people likes to live there, then now they have opportunity to get those people from capital back and be a nice place for them as a hometown.
Thank you very much. I was in Venice for the last time, I think it was a year and a half ago in September at the Art Biennial, Biennale, and a month later the floods started. So that's the reality of Venice. This city kind of reminds us of this urgent, pressing issue of climate change. And the chief curator of the International Architecture exhibit, Hashim Sarkis, says also in his introductory text that climate change is one of the key words, the buzzwords of this year's Biennale. So how has this new reality impacted architecture? Let's start this round of discussion again from Lithuania. Climate change and architecture. How much architects have to think of those changing realities in our world?
I think architecture in general, not specific, this Lithuanian Space Agency is dealing with environmental issues in a broad sense of the word, not only as a material-based approach. What I hear here is also how can technology, how can social issues contribute to a better life on world? That is, I think, what is how the broadened scope of architecture is also contributing to a climate debate in the best possible way. The footprint of the building industry is enormously high. 60% of the carbon footprint is made when buildings are built, not when they are there, but the moment they are built itself, then a building is quite impactful for environment.
So Latvian view. This kind of broad question, architecture today and climate.
Yes, well, as architects and as professionals, we have a really significant responsibility towards everybody else. And we are on the brink of ecological collapse, and architecture is trying to find its place in this new changed circumstance. And if we want to preserve any semblance of our present lives, our best bet in the fight against the climate change is technology, especially if it comes to buildings. But rapid technological change can bring forth resistance amongst the users of architecture, especially if they are not really on board with the whole idea of climate change. So the role of architecture and our goal should be to bridge that gap, to take into account this human perspective and to take into account this possible resistance towards technological change while cutting our CO2 levels in a maximally unobtrusive way. That's a real challenge for all of us.
So Finland and your view of climate change and architecture.
Yeah, I mean, I think climate change is the elephant in the room, so to speak, in every discussion about architecture nowadays. And one of the reasons that we thought it was useful to go back as curators and look historically at the post-war period was because some of these questions of the destruction wrought by war, I think it's not unfair to say that the destruction that will be wrought by climate change, even if we manage to slow it, will result in needs that architects must fulfill. And if we do those by the sort of means that we've been using, then we're liable to exacerbate the situation. I think part of the reason we like to focus on wood is because a lot of contemporary wood architecture has been based on logics of carbon sequestration and storage, and those are reasonable, but those are also perhaps not the only means that architecture is going to need. We're not only going to be able to sort of store carbon. In fact, we also need to consider what are we going to do about the destruction that is wrought by climate change and the kind of weather events that come with it, which we're already beginning to see. And I think that in this way, architecture has a great deal to consider about how the sort of the urgency of housing especially will be defining in the decades to come.
But talking about wood has become really a luxury material because we talk about deforestation. In Estonia, we talk about disappearing forest. The wood that seems to us really the essential material for building is becoming a luxury. And you are maybe exploring that issue also.
Well, I think it's probably, wood can be a luxury or it can be luxurious, but it still remains a very economical building material. One of the things, though, that has to be said and isn't said often enough with regard to wood architecture is that not all wood is the same. Wood, when we're talking about the use of wood in architecture, we have to consider from where it is coming. We have to consider that it is fundamentally tied to forest landscapes. We cannot escape the fact that wood doesn't sort of just come out of the earth. In fact, it's always coming from the forests. And if those forests, if the source material is poorly managed, is overexploited, then there's nothing sustainable about wood construction. This is a reality that everyone in the industry has to face. But when well managed, there's no shortage of wood material globally. If we think about the sort of global resources, there's no reason that we should not be using wood as an energetically and environmentally reasonable way to consider the amount of construction that will be coming in the future decades.
Thank you. Very important points. Switzerland, climate change and architecture. Your pavilion is about borders, borderlands, but this issue of borders and migration comes to mind also when we talk about climate change. People are starting to move because of those new climatic conditions. So how you see the broader discussion about architecture and climate?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing I want to say that it's about concerning our theme of the border. It's completely impossible to work on climate crisis today, considering the national borders. So climate crisis have nothing to do with the borders. So it's like a contradiction. It's like a shock between the climate crisis and national borders. And the second thing, you are absolutely right. It's probably I'm completely convinced that it will be the problem that we have to face in this coming decades about the concrete consequence of the climate crisis would probably is a migration crisis, and we will have to face this problem on our borders. And you can see today the pushbacks all around Europe. It's a phenomenon of migration and borders, and we have absolutely, as architects, we have absolutely. It's an urgency, how we said that, to rethink borders as a place of hosting people and not as a place of authority and a place of power, you know. And this is absolutely important. This is absolutely crucial, I think. Nowadays, borders are just between the hands of policy, of military, and we have to take take collectively with people who are living on the borders as architects, as urbanists, we have to look at these places and to reconsider them, because the problem is coming and we are looking outside.
Let's move our discussion to the British Isles. When Switzerland comes up on European map as a country with borders that is not part of the European Union, Britain also now, after Brexit, is separate, but it can't be separated from Europe. And when we're talking about climate change, of course not.
Yeah, I mean, climate change absolutely is sort of the biggest issue of our generation. And as architects, you know, it's vital that we engage in this. Sort of, I think 2019, 40% of the world's carbon emissions were from the construction industry. And as architects, we're quite uniquely placed in this conversation because we work across the different scales of a city, from sort of the most strategic kind of master planning scale right the way down to detailed design. And at every stage, we can be doing better to embed sort of principles of sustainable design. But also, this isn't a conversation to be having just within our silos. It's so important, as was previously said, that, you know, this is like a global discussion and a together globally, and also sort of outside of our industry by collaborating with policymakers, you know, with local communities, with everyone being part of this conversation. That's when we can really start to make beneficial change. In the UK, we've got huge issues with sort of our building regulations often holding us back from building more sustainably, for example. And by sort of putting the pressure on policymakers and legislators to really change those, that's the way that we can really start to see a kind of future, I think, where we can actually live on our planet. So yeah, I think it really is one of the important things about having this international biennale, that we can sort of come together and start to really discuss these issues and lessons learnt from where we're all living. How do we actually come together to see a future where we can all live?
And the second opinion from the UK.
Thank you. I think that we believe really strongly, and that's what we've tried to explore in the pavilion, that the architect has an important role to play as a communicator. And as I think so many people have said already, the only way to solve something as complex as climate change, or even to start to address it, is to really bring different people around the table from different disciplines to solve the kind of wider systemic problem. And we're at a moment in time where we're facing crises on multiple fronts, whether that's the public health crisis of the pandemic, issues of race and inequality in terms of like who has access to certain opportunities around the world, and then climate change, which is felt unequally in different places. And so how do we actually work together to change that? And in terms of what we're exploring in the pavilion in privatized public space, we're trying to think about how these spaces can really be designed not just for humans, but for all sorts of wilder ecologies, and how, as we've seen in the last year, as humans retreated from cities, so much of nature kind of expanded and started to occupy cities in new and exciting ways. So there doesn't need to be the separation between city and countryside if we actually enable all of us as a wider ecosystem to live together. And so I think that question posed by Hashim Sarkis on how will we live together extends as a kind of multi-species, multi-scalar issue that we all need to engage with quite urgently.
And the view from Estonia on climate change and architecture.
Okay, climate change are topic even in small towns. And in fact, we feel two kinds of possible profit what small towns can get from this change. First is what was mentioned on the beginning by our Lithuanian colleague, that in fact we waste really a lot of energy to build something new. So if we are able to slow down those demographic processes what we are living now through when people are moving from all over the country to the capital, and then from the capital to the suburbs, and if we will succeed to hold some part of those people in their hometown, then in fact we need to build much less. And if we are building less, then we are wasting less energy. And second thing is that future energy is local energy. Energy which is produced locally and normally you need space for. you need space for winter energy, for solar energy. And in shrinking environments, you have space, and the space is quite cheap. So once we feel that it can be chance for locals, for small towns to profit from this new type of energies which will come definitely.
And the final topic I would like to explore here is the beauty in architecture. That was the topic of the Architectural Biennale in Tallinn, the last Biennale that was here some 2 years ago. And there was a big debate about it. Should the architecture be considered beautiful? What is beauty in architecture? We should talk about functionality first. So your views, beauty in architecture. Let's do a round of opinions on that topic too. Should architecture be beautiful? And what is beautiful in architecture? Let's start from Lithuania.
Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I think what is important here to say is that the Lithuanian Space Agency indeed uses aesthetics and prototypes but mainly sensorial experiences to let people understand how we can live differently together. So kind of experience of gravity, a different experience of gravity, a different choreography through space itself will lead us to different insights how that architecture can let us feel differently. And this will lead to the experiment that we all will build together there and build a planet of people. That is how we will use sensorial experiences to construct a new understanding of beauty in the Lithuanian Space Agency, which is the Lithuanian Pavilion.
So what is the Latvian view of beauty?
Yeah, thanks. It's really a wonderful question and topic to explore. As architects, we can get really caught up in all sorts of issues, social, urban, ecological, while traditionally architecture solved the needs of an individual who needed a shelter that had to be functional, durable, and beautiful, or sometimes it solved the city, and then we add a social dimension. And now we solve global problems. And of course, that global climate change doesn't care for beauty at all. But people do, and we still make architecture for people. And I think that in this changing world, aesthetics can be a visual language, a sort of narrative through which people can make sense of the world. And the more complex and interconnected the world is, the more there is a need to make sense of it. So I would argue that the importance of beauty in architecture grows with time, and we need it more and more.
Let's move on to Finland. The beauty of wooden architecture, nobody will dispute that the wooden architecture is beautiful. But where you place the importance of beauty in the architectural process now?
It's a very challenging question, and I would agree that one of the things that we do kind of put on the table is the question of materiality in relation to beauty. But I would say the other thing that's put forth in the Finnish pavilion this year is a kind of consideration of the sort of everyday landscapes, the everyday environments that we inhabit. And I would second the words of my two previous colleagues in saying that I think as architects, it's important that we not allow discussions of beauty to be reduced to the idea that beauty is somehow a kind of embellishment that is unessential. I think aesthetic experience is fundamentally something that we as architects can be experts in. And perhaps, if anything, I would argue for the sort of way in which beauty requires a certain degree of intensity and intensity of experience that is very important and cannot be sort of cast away from architecture. So shortly, I think beauty is still very much part of the equation. And as architects, we should hold on to it tightly and not allow our work to become exclusively reduced to functionality or to a kind of expediency of either economic or pragmatic concerns.
And next up on our virtual stage is Switzerland.
Yeah, like my colleagues, I'm not sure that there is a contradiction between social work, political engagement, and aesthetics or beauty. I think that they could come together, and they have to come together in our work as architects. I have in mind a lot of examples of architects that they do architecture with a social engagement, and they are absolutely an amazing artists. So I think that they could come together, and they have to come together and it's our work to do that.
Let's go to Britain.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good question that you could do a whole biennale on it, which you did. But I suppose our exhibition, The Garden of Privatised Delights, we're really advocating for why can't every space in the city be a garden of delights? You know, I think we really believe in the importance of having spaces that bring joy in your everyday life, and the importance of opening up public space so that everyone can enjoy that beauty, and, you know, sort of that it can become embedded in the importance of sort of your mental and physical well-being when you're exploring a city. And as everyone has previously just said, sort of beauty, it's such an important part of the conversation, but it's part of this kind of wider kind of network that we create in our cities and our spaces. And so thinking about how beauty, I suppose, relates to the city as a whole, and making sure that everyone has access to enjoying that beauty.
And your colleague?
It's a real, I guess, thing that it's really important to us that we place value on beauty. And I think the twinning of beauty and delight in our pavilion is really important in terms of how creating beautiful spaces might actually make people stay in them for longer or care for them more. And how things like color that we take for granted in cities and spaces will actually make people pay more attention to the city and make them more inspiring places to live in and inhabit. And so for us, it's really important that that spirit of delight carries through to architecture in terms of how we design it, but also how the public can engage with it more. And so it's something that, you know, we've found really important in the development of this project. And, you know, the main question that we've asked of all these spaces is really how can all public spaces be designed as gardens of delight?
And final view from Estonia.
Architecture and beauty. Architecture deals with spaces, environment, and space creates emotions, it's clear. And beauty is positive emotion. So it's really necessary that architects and architecture deal with this, with beauty, because what would be the opposite? But in the case of small shrinking towns, maybe it's even more important, because we argue that that if the environment is attractive, if it's beautiful, then there is less people leaving, and more locals investing their time and money to making environment even better. So beauty can be a motor for a driver for the change. So beauty is definitely important in architecture.
Thank you all very much for this interesting, probing discussion. It's been interesting, enlightening 90 minutes we spent together on this virtual square, and hope to see you all in Venice. So thank you very much for taking your time and participating today in our program. And we have to add that this online event is supported by the Baltic Culture Fund that was established in 2018 to promote cultural cooperation between the Baltic states. Our virtual meeting marks also the opening of a new internet portal by the Estonian Centre of Architecture. In this space, you can now virtually explore the national pavilions that are open in Venice this year. But we all do hope, of course, that we can soon actually physically meet in Venice at the Biennale. With that hope, we say today goodbye from Tallinn. See you all soon.